In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no peace, only the echo of war that never dies. And if I told you that humanity's greatest enemy isn't the ancient powers of chaos or the soulless legions of the Necrons, but laughing, screaming green monsters who live only for destruction, would you believe me? Most wouldn't. Most imagine war as something calculated, something driven by ideology or conquest. But the Orks are different. They don't wage war for glory or territory or power. They fight because it is in their very blood. They fight because it is the only thing that makes them feel alive. Tonight, I will tell you the story of a world that screamed for help, and help came too late for many. A world that believed itself safe, tucked away in a quiet corner of the Imperium. A world called Valrathon IX. A simple mining colony, far from the front lines of galactic conflict. A place where families woke each day to the sound of drills, not gunfire. A place where people believed war would never touch them. But the galaxy does not care for belief, and peace is always the final breath before the blade falls. It began with a shadow on the sky. Just a flicker at first, dismissed by the Planetary Defense Force as a sensor glitch, a passing anomaly. The miners went to work as usual. Children played in the dust-filled streets. Administratum officials filed their endless paperwork. But high above the clouds, something ancient, something furious, something impossibly vast was moving. A storm of metal and fire, a storm carrying a single deafening cry, WAAAGH! No one on Valrathon IX understood what that cry meant. Not yet. The first explosion tore through the eastern district with the force of a falling star. People stopped, confused, staring upward as burning chunks of metal rained from the heavens. Then came the sound, raw, animalistic, joyful in its violence. A chorus of Orks screaming as their crude drop pods smashed into the ground like meteor strikes. Buildings shattered, streets ripped open, flames shot skyward. And from every burning crater, roaring with laughter and murder lust, poured the green-skinned monsters of legend. Hulking, muscular beasts, wielding jagged blades, rusted guns, and weapons that shouldn't work, yet somehow did. The defenders of Valrathon IX tried to fight. They rallied what little courage they had. Las guns fired, sirens wailed, civilians fled. But the Orks only laughed. Every death fueled their frenzy. Every explosion made them shout louder. And as the world burned, one final hope streaked across the void. Far above the chaos, aboard a lone strike cruiser, the distress signal was received. Armored giants moved through dimly lit corridors, their boots like thunder. The Space Marines, warriors bred for battle, sculpted by gene forging, sworn to the Imperium, prepared to descend. They were few, but each one was a weapon in human form. As the planet below drowned in flames, they armed themselves in silence. Bolters locked into place, helmets sealed, sacred oaths whispered. For these warriors knew what the people of Valrathon IX had just discovered. The Orks had not come for conquest. They had come for the joy of battle, for the thrill of breaking bones and shattering steel. They had come simply because they heard the call of war and followed it as instinctively as breath. And now, as Thunderhawk engines ignited and fire washed over the hull, the Space Marines prepared to meet the storm head-on. For the Emperor, for humanity, for a world already drowning in blood. And as you listen to this story, remember, this is not a tale of heroes and villains. This is the grim truth of a galaxy devoured by eternal war, where entire worlds are lost not because of strategy, but because somewhere, out in the void, an orc felt bored. And when an orc grows bored, a world dies.
Valrathon IX had never been a world of drama or danger. It was the kind of place where people lived their entire lives without ever seeing a weapon drawn in anger, without ever imagining that war, true war, could touch them. The planet's surface was a patchwork of mining pits, processing plants, worker settlements, and dust-covered roads that stretched like faded scars across the barren ground. Every sunrise looked the same, a deep orange glow leaking over the horizon, illuminating the endless fields of rock and metal. Every sunset felt predictable, steady, safe. For decades, the people of Valrathon IX had believed they existed on the edge of the Imperium's attention, a quiet, forgotten place where nothing catastrophic could possibly occur. Life moved slowly here. Miners woke before dawn, pulling on heavy gear and descending into the great tunnels that ran beneath the surface like veins. Their days were long, filled with the rhythmic pounding of drills and the glow of lanterns cutting through thick dust. In the settlements above, children ran between metal huts, chasing each other through winding alleys. Market vendors shouted for business. Administratum scribes filed reports that no one actually read. Local enforcers patrolled without urgency, their greatest concerns being drunken brawls or equipment theft. The people trusted their routines. They trusted in distance. They trusted that the galaxy's horrors would never find them. There were whispers, however, small ones, thin as smoke. A machine spirit glitch in an orbital sensor, a static burst across a long-range Vox channel, a faint metallic echo picked up by a deep mining scanner. None of these signs seemed significant on their own, and every officer in the Planetary Defense Force dismissed them as harmless anomalies. After all, mining operations often created disturbances. Machinery malfunctioned, Vox lines degraded. Strange noises were simply part of life under kilometers of metal and stone. On the outskirts of the main settlement, an old tech priest named Varen was repairing a data terminal when he noticed a pattern in the disturbances. Numbers shifting in a way that didn't match geological activity. A sudden spike in atmospheric entry readings that vanished a moment later. His mechanical eyes flickered with concern, and he attempted to run diagnostics, but even he could not fully interpret the warning signs. When he filed his report, it was stamped, logged, and neatly ignored. Meanwhile, the people continued their quiet existence. Workers gathered at a small cantina after long shifts, sharing drinks and stories. A group of children laughed as they kicked a ball made of scrap cloth. Traders haggled over spare parts flown in from neighboring systems. The hum of machinery and the smell of hot metal drifted through the streets like a comforting blanket. Valrathon IX was not rich, nor glamorous, but it was stable, and stability felt like safety. Night fell with its usual stillness. The sky above was a dome of stars stretching endlessly outward, untouched and unreachable. No one on Valrathon IX ever looked up with fear. Stars were just stars, beautiful, distant, harmless. But on this night, there was a brief flicker, a tiny streak like a falling spark. A miner on the night shift pointed it out to his friend with mild curiosity, but they both shrugged it off. Probably a micrometeor, one said. Nothing to worry about. And yet, far above the calm surface of the world, beyond the quiet mining towns and the slow heartbeat of daily life, something enormous was moving. Something watching. Something closing in with unstoppable momentum. But down on the planet, no one sensed the danger. No one felt the galaxy leaning toward them like a predator preparing to strike. For now, Valrathon IX slept in peace, unaware that its final days of quiet life were slipping away, softly, silently, like dust through open fingers.
The sky above Valrathon IX was always vast, empty, and calm, or so the people had believed. But that night, the first hints of chaos streaked across it, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, like a tremor before an earthquake. A faint flicker on the orbital sensors went unnoticed by the planetary defense forces, dismissed as a calibration error. Deep in the mines, the workers heard a distant metallic hum that resonated through the tunnels, vibrating their teeth and rattling their tools, but they assumed it was just another machinery quirk. Even the old tech priest Varen, who had always been meticulous, failed to fully interpret the signals, though a cold knot of unease settled in his chest. Something was approaching, something enormous, but no one could have known the scale of what was about to strike. And then, as the world slept under the deceptive calm of a starry sky, the first Ork drop pods tore through the atmosphere like green burning comets. Fire and smoke streaked across the night, illuminating the hills and plains with eerie greenish flames. Civilians paused in confusion, pointing upward, unsure if what they saw was a meteor storm or some impossible apocalyptic phenomenon. But there was no time for confusion. Impact followed immediately, violent and merciless. The pods smashed into mining compounds, warehouses, and supply depots. The ground shook violently, sending dust and debris flying through the streets. Roofs collapsed. Vehicles were crushed under the weight of falling metal. And then the Orks emerged, hulking, muscular, green-skinned creatures, wielding jagged blades and crude guns, their eyes wild with unrestrained fury, their voices raised in the deafening battle cry that would come to haunt the planet for years. WAAAGH. The first wave of Orks was small, only a handful compared to the legions that would follow. Yet they were enough to decimate the unprepared defenses. The planetary PDF mobilized what forces they had. Las guns fired into the night, and the occasional pulse of heavier weaponry lit up the darkness. Civilians screamed and fled in every direction, stumbling over rubble and debris. But the Orks only laughed. Their voices were high-pitched, guttural, and filled with joy at the sheer destruction they were causing. Every death, every explosion, every building reduced to splinters fed their frenzy, spurring them onward like a tide that could not be turned back. Hulking Nobz advanced alongside the smaller Boyz, swinging their massive axes and firing ramshackle guns that somehow tore through steel doors and armored vehicles alike. Mech boys were already setting up crude siege engines and war machines, welding together scrap that should never have held under the force of its own weight, yet worked perfectly in the hands of Orks. High above, Weirdboyz crackled with uncontrolled psychic energy, sending sparks of green lightning cascading through the buildings, setting fires in erratic patterns, and terrorizing the fleeing population. It was not organized, at least not in any human sense, yet it was terrifyingly effective. The Orks were instinct, war incarnate, unstoppable and unrelenting. As chaos unfolded, families were torn from their homes. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed and screaming, while miners fled from deep tunnels, unsure if the shaking they felt was from cave-ins or something far worse. Streets that had been quiet only hours before were now rivers of fire and metal, littered with the bodies of the fallen. Smoke obscured the stars, turning the sky into a hellish canvas of fire, chaos, and screaming orcs. For the people of Valrathon IX, the world that they had known was gone, replaced with a nightmare that no one could have imagined. Amidst the chaos, the planetary defense forces attempted to form a line, desperate to slow the green tide. But every tactic failed. Orks were not disciplined soldiers. They were a storm, a living force of pure aggression. They adapted instantly to every defensive maneuver, throwing themselves into barricades and armor with insane courage and reckless abandon. Nobz tore through reinforced doors, crushing defenders under their massive boots. Boyz swarmed over walls and gates, climbing atop each other like living ladders to overwhelm positions that should have held for hours. Even the supposedly safe orbital installations were not immune. Small orc fighters, ramshackle craft held together by wires and ductwork, dove from the sky to smash into supply satellites and communication relays, cutting off any chance of external assistance. The people of Valrathon IX for the first time understood what it meant to be utterly unprepared for war. Their routines, their machinery, their false sense of safety, all of it was meaningless against creatures that lived and breathed for violence. And yet, even in the face of this overwhelming onslaught, small acts of heroism began to appear. Miners grabbed what weapons they could find and tried to protect civilians. Officers risked their lives to coordinate evacuations, moving families toward underground shelters. Even Varen, the old tech priest, attempted to use ancient machinery to create defensive turrets, knowing it might be the only way to save lives. Every action, no matter how small, was a defiance against the unstoppable tide, but it was like holding back the sea with bare hands. Then, as the night reached its darkest point, the scale of the orc invasion became horrifyingly clear. From distant hills and valleys, more green shapes emerged, carrying banners of crude metal and bone. The first wave was a warning. The second wave was the beginning of a WAAAGH that would consume the planet entirely. War Boss Grimskull to Iron Chomper was leading the charge, larger than any creature the people had ever seen, his armor a patchwork of stolen plates and reinforced scrap, his eyes alight with the joy of war. Around him, Nobz, Boyz, and Weirdboyz surged forward like an unstoppable avalanche, roaring and laughing, setting fire to anything that moved. By the time the orbital sensors picked up the second wave, it was too late. Valrathon IX was already on fire. Smoke and flames filled every corner of the settlements. Civilians fled wherever they could, though there was no safe place to hide. And somewhere high above, streaking through the atmosphere, a single hope descended from the stars. The distant silhouette of a Space Marine strike cruiser, unaware that by the time it arrived, the battle below would already have claimed countless lives. Valrathon IX had fallen into the hands of chaos incarnate, and the people of the planet were only beginning to understand the horror that the orcs brought with them. A storm that was only just beginning, and one that would test the limits of courage, survival, and humanity itself.
The first glimmers of hope came from above, the distant silhouette of a strike cruiser moving through the void toward Valrathon IX. Even in the chaos below, where fire and smoke obscured the burning cities, the sharp outlines of the Imperial vessel cut a reassuring figure across the horizon. Its engines glowed with the power of 1,000 reactors, a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling beneath it. Inside the massive hull, the warriors of the Imperium prepared for battle, their minds focused, their hearts steady, their bodies conditioned for the violence they were about to unleash. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were Space Marines, genetically enhanced superhuman warriors, the Emperor's angels of death,
and they had arrived just in time to confront an enemy unlike any the galaxy had seen before. Captain Thalor, commanding officer of the arriving squadron, stood on the observation deck, his armor reflecting the pale light of the stars. His eyes, hardened by countless campaigns across the galaxy, scanned the planet below. Flames licked at the edges of the sprawling settlements. Smoke rose in vast pillars, blotting out the familiar constellations. The initial Ork raids had already shattered the local defense forces, leaving the planet's inhabitants vulnerable, terrified, and disoriented. He took a deep breath, the air inside the cruiser heavy with the scent of machine oil, burnt servos, and the faint tang of sacred incense. "Brothers," he said, his voice steady and commanding, amplified through the Vox network so that every Marine could hear. "Today, we do not defend a planet. We defend the very soul of humanity itself. For the Emperor." A chorus of armored voices responded in unison, the sound carrying a terrifying weight. The Space Marines moved with precision, donning their helmets, sealing their power armor, and checking the alignment of their bolters. Tactical squads, Devastators, Assault Marines, and Terminators assembled, each unit fully aware of its role in the coming storm. Even amidst the chaos of the vessel's preparation, there was an unspoken camaraderie, a silent understanding that the coming battle would demand everything from them, and that each man was prepared to give it. The strike cruiser shuddered as it entered the upper atmosphere, its massive engines igniting into a controlled fury. Thunderhawks detached from the vessel, their descent cutting a trail of fire and smoke across the horizon. Below, the burning city of Valrathon IX stretched out like a scarred canvas, the glow of fire reflecting in the eyes of those few who still clung to hope. As the first Thunderhawk touched down on a shattered plaza, its ramp descended with a metallic screech. Space Marines flowed out in perfect formation, their movement a study in lethal efficiency. The ground trembled under the weight of their armor, and the Orks, momentarily distracted by the sudden appearance of these giants, hesitated in their frenzy, uncertain for the first time that their overwhelming numbers would be enough. Captain Thalor led the first squads into the streets, their boots pounding against the cracked concrete, bolters firing in controlled bursts to push back the closest Ork attackers. The chaos around them was overwhelming. Buildings were ablaze, Ork war machines rumbled through the city, and every shadow seemed to hide a new threat. But the Space Marines advanced with unwavering discipline, a wall of steel and determination cutting through the madness. Civilians, previously cowering in fear, began to emerge from hiding, guided to safety by the Marines' presence. Their hope, fragile and flickering, was reignited by the sheer authority and power of these warriors. As the first wave of Orks regrouped, they realized that the enemy they faced was unlike any they had encountered before. Nobz and Boyz, confident in their chaotic strength, surged forward, their massive axes and crude firearms aimed at the advancing Marines. Mech Boys attempted to deploy small war machines, each clanking monstrosity hurling sparks and jagged metal into the ranks of the defenders. Above them, Weirdboyz twisted the very fabric of reality with psychic energy, hurling arcs of green lightning across streets and rooftops. Buildings exploded, debris rained down, and screams of both humans and Orks filled the air. And yet, despite the intensity of the assault, the Space Marines held their formation, their tactics precise, their resolve unbreakable. Captain Thalor moved through the battlefield like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of destruction. He directed the Devastators to elevated positions, raining bolter fire down on the charging Orks, breaking their initial momentum. Tactical squads cleared streets methodically, protecting civilians while neutralizing threats. Assault Marines launched themselves into combat with their jump packs, their chain swords and power weapons tearing through the green tide. Every movement, every action, every shot was calculated to maximize efficiency and minimize collateral damage. The difference between these warriors and the Orks was stark.
While the Orks thrived on chaos, the Marines thrived on order, discipline, and strategic precision. Amidst the carnage, small moments of heroism shone through. Sergeant Aurelius, leading a small squad through a particularly devastated residential district, encountered a group of children trapped beneath a collapsed building. Ignoring the fire and Ork firepower converging around him, he pried away debris, lifted beams with his enhanced strength, and carried the children to safety. His armor was scorched, his helmet cracked, but he continued without hesitation, embodying the martial spirit and humanity that the Emperor had instilled in every Space Marine. Above the city, the sky was still alive with movement. Ork dropships continued to rain down reinforcements, each vessel crashing into streets and plazas, adding to the chaos. The scale of the Ork invasion became horrifyingly clear to Thalor. This was not a raid. This was an all-out assault. Somewhere on the horizon, Warbus Grimskull de Ironchampa orchestrated the green tide, larger than any creature the planet had seen before, his presence enough to rally the Orks into a frenzy that threatened to overwhelm even the disciplined ranks of the Space Marines. Yet Thalor remained calm. He had faced impossible odds before, and he understood that victory demanded patience, strategy, and the courage to stand unwavering in the face of absolute chaos. The battle continued to escalate, a violent dance of order against anarchy. Bolter fire flashed against the dark, smoky backdrop. Chainswords met axes with sparks flying in every direction. Explosions tore through buildings as war machines collided, and psychic energies from Weirdboyz met librarian defenses with crackling intensity. Despite the overwhelming numbers of the enemy, the Space Marines methodically pushed forward, securing key points, rescuing civilians, and drawing Ork forces into tactical traps. Each small victory was hard-won, but it was a demonstration of the Emperor's will manifested in flesh and armor. By the time the first engagement drew to a close, the city was a battered, smoking battlefield. Streets were littered with debris, and the cries of the dying and wounded filled the air. Yet the Space Marines had made a critical difference. They had slowed the Orks, protected countless civilians, and established a foothold in the city that would serve as a base for future operations. Captain Thalor surveyed the scene from the top of a shattered building, his armor scorched but intact, his eyes calculating the next steps. He knew that this was only the beginning. The Orks would regroup, bringing more numbers, more ferocity, and more chaos. But the Imperium had arrived, and while Valrathon IX was far from safe, hope still burned bright in the hearts of those who survived. The first wave of salvation had arrived, and for the people of Valrathon IX, the sight of the Emperor's angels descending from the sky was a revelation, that even in the face of utter chaos, humanity could still fight back. Yet the shadow of the wall was long, and Warboss Grimskull's laughter echoed across the burning horizon. The true storm had only just begun.
The first encounter had shown the people of Valrathon IX what real war looked like, and the Space Marines had made a difference, but it was only the beginning. As dawn approached, smoke still hung heavy over the city, and the faint orange light of the rising sun did little to illuminate the devastation. Streets were littered with rubble, abandoned vehicles, and the bodies of both defenders and attackers. Fires burned unchecked in several districts, consuming warehouses, homes, and industrial machinery alike. Amidst this chaos, the Orks were not defeated, they were merely regrouping, feeding off the carnage and preparing for the next assault. Captain Thalor moved through the city with his tactical squad, assessing the situation. His power armor gleamed faintly under the glow of burning buildings, scarred from the first clashes, yet every movement was precise, every gesture deliberate. He paused atop a broken wall and surveyed the streets below. Ork bodies littered the avenues, but there was no sense of retreat, only pause. The green tide had not receded, it had only ebbed momentarily,
gathering strength for the next wave. Scouts reported movement on the horizon, smaller mobs looting and pillaging, reassembling for another push. Warboss Grimskull had yet to commit fully, but his presence was unmistakable. His hulking form could be seen directing the mobs with terrifying confidence, flanked by Nobz and Weirdboyz, their psychic powers beginning to pulse with a dangerous intensity. "This is no raid," Thalor muttered to Sergeant Aurelius, who stood beside him, bolter ready. "They are organizing. They are preparing for something far worse." Aurelius nodded grimly. "Then we will meet it with the Emperor's will. Let them come." The calm in their voices belied the tension of the situation. Every moment mattered. Every decision could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. The Orks were chaotic, unpredictable, and deadly, but their behavior was not entirely random. Their instinctive cunning and ability to adapt made them more dangerous than any conventional enemy. They attacked in overwhelming numbers, but each wave was carefully nudged by the warboss, whose understanding of battlefield psychology rivaled that of the most seasoned generals of the Imperium. As the Space Marines began to fortify key positions, the Orks unleashed a new form of assault. Mech boys, wielding tools and scrap machines, began erecting crude siege engines and armored contraptions from debris scattered across the city. These machines were held together by a combination of brute strength, welding, and a kind of Ork psychic faith. The more Orks believed a device would work, the more it actually did, defying logic, engineering, and sometimes even physics itself. Sparks flew, green energy crackled, and suddenly weapons erupted from the machines that had no right to function, firing shards of metal, fire, and energy into the streets. Simultaneously, Weirdboyz began to channel their psychic powers, twisting reality with uncontrollable energy. Lightning crackled from their fingertips, arcing through the air in jagged, unpredictable patterns. Buildings shuddered under the force of the Weirdboyz, debris flew like deadly projectiles, and even some of the stronger Ork machines buckled under their own chaotic energy. The very air seemed to vibrate with the power of the Orks, creating a tense and dangerous environment for both the defenders and the attacking creatures. Thalor knew that holding the streets would not be enough. He ordered Devastator squads to take elevated positions atop the remaining intact structures. From these vantage points, they could suppress Ork mobs, targeting mech boys and any Weirdboyz attempting to focus their powers on key areas. The thunder of heavy bolter fire echoed across the city, matching the chaos of the Orks' assault. Tactical squads cleared intersections and protected civilians while pulling back wounded survivors to safe zones. Every corner of the city became a microcosm of war. A room could be a battlefield in itself, and one street might see a dozen skirmishes erupt simultaneously. Yet despite the Space Marines' discipline and superior weaponry, the Orks adapted. Boys charged in greater numbers, climbing over rubble and each other to reach their targets. Nobz smashed through barricades, their sheer mass and rage overwhelming smaller defensive points. They fought with a singular joy that was horrifying to witness, laughing and screaming as they killed indiscriminately. Even the occasional casualties did not slow them. The Orks fed on the violence. They became stronger, more confident, and more aggressive with each clash. Amidst the devastation, Captain Thalor identified a critical target, a large assembly of Ork vehicles and war machines gathering in the Eastern District. If left unchecked, these constructs could destroy entire city blocks and crush defensive positions in a single push. He deployed a squad of assault marines with jump packs to intercept. The Marines leapt into the air, chainswords glowing and ready, landing amidst a tangle of Orks. Sparks flew as blades met jagged axes and crude firearms. Explosions shook the streets as grenades and bolter rounds tore through walls, metal, and orc flesh. The fight was brutal, close, and unforgiving. Yet each Marine moved with an almost preternatural efficiency, cutting through the chaos like a surgeon. While tactical squads fought for every inch of space in the streets, Sergeant Aurelius led a smaller unit to protect a cluster of civilian shelters. Families huddled together, terrified as orcs surged through surrounding streets. Aurelius and his Marines formed a defensive circle, bolters and chainswords repelling attackers while simultaneously evacuating the defenseless into underground tunnels. Every life saved was a small victory against the tide of destruction. Yet every moment stretched the Marines' endurance and resources thin. They were doing the impossible, holding a fragile line against a force that seemed endless. As the battle raged, it became clear that the Orks were not merely reacting, they were preparing for something greater. Scouts reported new formations on the horizon, vast mobs marching in unison under the banners of war boss Grimskull. The green tide was growing, larger and more coordinated than ever before. Even the Space Marines, who had faced impossible odds across countless campaigns, understood that the true test was still ahead. Grimskull was not just raiding for plunder. He was orchestrating a full-scale invasion, gathering every orc within range into a single devastating woo that would threaten to annihilate the city and crush the remaining defenders. Thalor issued orders with calm authority, repositioning squads to create choke points, reinforcing weak sectors, and preparing for a prolonged engagement. Every action was calculated to maximize the Space Marines' strengths and minimize casualties among civilians. Every Marine knew that retreat was not an option. Every step, every shot, every movement mattered, for they were not only fighting for survival, they were defending the future of Valrathon IX itself. By midday, the Orks had adapted their tactics further, using the terrain to their advantage, pushing through alleys and over rooftops, coordinating attacks despite their apparent chaos. But the Space Marines held firm, their superior training, discipline, and genetic enhancements allowing them to withstand wave after wave. Even as exhaustion set in, their will remained unbroken. Captain Thalor's presence was a beacon, a symbol of unyielding resistance, and under his leadership, the remaining civilians found the courage to survive. Yet as the sun climbed higher and the battle intensified, it became painfully clear that this was only the beginning. The Orks were gathering strength, building machines, and preparing for an assault far greater than anything the city had seen. The Space Marines had slowed the tide, but the true storm, the war itself, was still approaching. And Valrathon IX, battered and scarred, would soon find itself at the center of a war that would decide its very existence.
The city streets of Valrathon IX, still smoldering from the first encounters, became a scene of eerie anticipation. Smoke rose from crumbling buildings like black fingers clawing at the sky, the fires reflecting in the eyes of the remaining Orks as if feeding their frenzy. Even after the disciplined defense of the Space Marines, the Orks had not faltered. They had scattered, regrouped, and now the sound of heavy stomps, guttural laughter, and the creak of war machines began to echo across the ruined cityscape. This was no ordinary raid. This was the birth of a WAAAGH, a massive, coordinated surge of green-skinned destruction, guided by a singular, terrifying mind. War Boss Grimskull de Iron Champa. High above the ruins, atop a hill littered with the remnants of fallen factories and abandoned mining equipment, Grimskull surveyed the battlefield. His hulking frame was wrapped in patchwork armor constructed from salvaged metal plates, reinforced with bone and crude rivets. Bolts and chains rattled with every step, and warglyphs, scratched hastily into steel, glowed faintly with psychic energy. Around him, Nobz barked orders, swinging massive axes, while mech boys scurried over wreckage, piecing together scavenged scrap into crude, yet horrifyingly effective war machines. The war boss's eyes burned with an almost childlike joy. For him, this was not war, this was play, a colossal, violent game in which the stakes were the lives of every human on the planet below. "This world got lots of metal," he bellowed, his voice booming across the plains. "We's gonna make bigger guns, smash humies, WAAAGH!" His words, crude as they were, carried a magnetic power over his troops. Ork boys, drawn to the sheer charisma of their leader, surged forward, gnashing teeth and bellowing with excitement. It didn't matter that many of them had been beaten in the earlier skirmishes. The war boss's presence restored their confidence, their ferocity, and their madness. They were not soldiers, they were instinct incarnate, a tidal wave of violence waiting to be unleashed. Mech boys, working feverishly, began assembling new contraptions from the wreckage littering the city. Rusted plates became armor, broken engines became mobile artillery, and even shattered weapons were welded together into devices that should have fallen apart at first fire, but somehow, in the hands of an orc, they worked. Sparks flew in every direction as the mechs hammered and welded, their laughter mingling with the screams of civilians and the distant roar of bolters from Space Marine positions. Every new machine that emerged from the scrap pile was larger and more terrifying than the last. Massive scrap walkers lumbering across streets, equipped with spinning blades, crude cannons, and flamethrowers fueled by whatever flammable substance could be found. Above the melee, Weirdboyz levitated, their twisted bodies crackling with uncontrolled psychic energy. Green lightning arced from their hands to the ground, igniting fires, toppling weakened structures, and hurling debris through the air like shrapnel. The air itself seemed to hum with raw power, a dissonant chord of chaos that unnerved even the most battle-hardened defenders. Space Marines were forced to contend not only with the physical strength of the Orks, but with the unpredictable psychic storms that tore through the battlefield, disorienting troops and collapsing sections of what little cover remained. As Grimskull rallied his forces, he personally inspected the emerging vehicles, bellowing orders with a mix of menace and amusement. Nobz positioned themselves at the front, axes swinging and teeth bared, while Ork boys scrambled onto scrapwalkers to ride into the next wave of attack. Even the smaller mobs of green-skinned fighters were organized in their chaotic way, moving to cut off streets, occupy strategic intersections, and push the remaining human defenders toward kill zones where the war boss planned to strike with full force. Below the hill, the remnants of Valrathon IX's civilian population continued to flee. The Space Marines had established a fragile network of defensive lines, evacuating the injured and leading survivors to underground shelters. Captain Thalor, standing on a shattered rooftop with his tactical squad, watched the growing orc horde with unflinching eyes. The scale of what was coming became horrifyingly clear. The first wave had been nothing more than a test. This was the full tide of the WAAAGH, and Grimskull had mastered the chaos into a singular force. "Weapons ready," Thalor said to his squad, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "They're not stopping. Not now, not ever. We hold here or we die. The Emperor protects." The Space Marines spread out, forming choke points along the main avenues, using the ruined buildings to channel the Orks into areas where bolters, heavy weapons, and tactical coordination could inflict maximum damage. Even so, the city was already overwhelmed. Every street, Every alley and every intersection became a miniature battlefield, with skirmishes erupting simultaneously. The Orks were relentless, climbing over rubble, smashing through barricades, and advancing under the protection of their makeshift artillery. The clash of bolters and crude weaponry echoed like thunder through the streets, punctuated by the high-pitched laughter of Boyz and the occasional psychic eruption from Weirdboyz. Grimskull's plan was methodical, in its own chaotic way. He would not simply overwhelm the defenders. He would break them, tire them, force them into desperation. Every scrapwalker that lumbered forward, every explosion that leveled a street, every psychic blast that tore through buildings was part of a larger design, to make the Space Marines fight not just for victory, but for survival itself. From his vantage point, Grimskull watched as new waves of Orks marched down the horizon, carrying banners adorned with skulls, chains, and crude glyphs of green energy. The WAAAGH was growing exponentially, feeding on destruction, adapting to resistance, and preparing to engulf every sector of the city. Even the distant fires were being used as signals, guiding additional mobs and signaling the locations of vulnerable targets. The sheer scale of the impending assault was staggering, and yet the war boss laughed at it all, delighting in the chaos he was creating. Below, Thalor and his Marines understood that the battle would not be won by mere strength alone. They had to anticipate, adapt, and exploit the Orks' limited understanding of tactics without underestimating the ingenuity of their instinct chaos. Every squad, every devastator, every terminator had a specific role in the defense, forming a network of resistance across a city that seemed destined for annihilation. Yet the pressure was relentless. Ammunition ran low, explosives were finite, civilians continued to require protection. Every moment stretched their endurance, testing the limits of both human and superhuman endurance. As the sun climbed higher, the WAAAGH finally surged forward in a unified assault. Scrapwalkers charged, crushing barricades, while Nobz and Boyz surged into the fray with terrifying aggression. Psychic storms from Weirdboyz tore apart sections of the battlefield, forcing Marines to adapt on the fly. The city shook under the combined weight of destruction, fire, and psychic energy. And at the center of it all, War Boss Grimskull roared with unrestrained glee, leading the Green Tide into a battle that would decide the fate of Valrathon IX. For the people below, there was only one truth left to cling to. Survival depended not on luck, not on chance, but on the steadfast courage of the Emperor's angels, and the hope that somewhere in the chaos, victory could still be carved from the jaws of overwhelming madness.
The streets of Valrathon IX had become a battlefield unlike any other in the galaxy. Smoke and fire blotted out the sun, painting the ruined city in shades of orange and black. The cries of the wounded and dying echoed through shattered alleyways, mingling with the guttural laughter of Orks and the thunder of bolters. The Space Marines had slowed the wall, but the cost had been high, and the strain on their numbers and resources was beginning to show. Captain Thalor moved through the streets, his armor scarred and scorched from repeated firefights, his eyes scanning for threats even as debris fell around him. The battle was no longer just about repelling the Orks. It was about holding the line long enough to regroup and find a way to turn the tide. The Orks had learned quickly. After suffering losses in earlier skirmishes, the war boss Grimskull had adapted his strategies, coordinating waves of Boyz and Nobz in a way that demonstrated more than mere instinct. Scouts darted through ruins, guiding larger mobs into choke points where the Space Marines had positioned themselves. Mech Boys worked feverishly to repair and modify their crude machines, welding scrap into new weapons capable of leveling entire city blocks.
And high above the battlefield, Weirdboyz continued to unleash psychic storms, their green energy crackling unpredictably and tearing through streets, walls, and even some of the Marines' defensive positions. Thalor knew that holding the line required constant adaptation. He repositioned tactical squads to reinforce areas under heavy attack, and deployed devastator teams to elevated positions where they could rain bolter fire down onto the advancing mobs. Every shot was calculated to maximize casualties, while minimizing the risk to civilians who were still trapped in pockets throughout the city. Assault Marines, with their jump packs, launched lightning strikes against enemy machines and concentrated groups of Orks, their chainswords and power weapons cutting through the green tide with terrifying efficiency. Yet even as the Space Marines executed their strategies, the pressure continued to mount. Ammunition stocks were running dangerously low, and some of the heavier weaponry had already been damaged by repeated assaults. Civilians continued to require protection, forcing the Marines to divide their attention between offensive action and defensive operations. Every choice carried consequences, and every decision was made with the knowledge that a single mistake could allow the Orks to break through and overrun their positions. "Captain Thalor, status report," Thalor called as he advanced through a narrow street, bolter raised and senses alert. "Eastern sector is holding, Captain," Aurelius replied, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Civilians are mostly accounted for, though some are trapped in the lower levels. We're running low on explosives, and the Orks are adapting to our choke points. They're learning our patterns." Thalor nodded grimly. He had anticipated this. The Orks were dangerous, not just because of their strength, but because of their relentless ability to adapt. "Then we make new patterns," he said, determination in his voice. "We force them into our traps or we die trying. The Emperor protects, but we still must fight." As they moved forward, the Space Marines encountered a massive Ork war machine, a lumbering construct of scrap metal and spiked wheels, bristling with crude artillery. It rolled through the street like a battering ram, crushing vehicles and debris alike. Bolter fire barely slowed it, and even power weapons had difficulty penetrating its reinforced plating. Thalor gestured to a nearby devastator squad, signaling them to concentrate fire on the machine's weak points. Explosions erupted as bolter rounds and missiles struck the construct, but the Orks inside laughed, confident in the durability of their creation. Meanwhile, Ork boys surged from side streets, swarming the remaining human defenders in overwhelming numbers. Sergeant Aurelius and his squad held firm, bolter and chainsword cutting through the wave. But for every Ork that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The streets became a chaotic melee, every step contested, every building a potential death trap. Civilians screamed from hiding places, and the Marines had to constantly redirect their attention to protect them, further stretching their already thin resources. Amid the chaos, Captain Thalor noticed the telltale signs of psychic activity. Weirdboyz were gathering energy, their forms twisting unnaturally as green lightning danced around them. One in particular floated above a partially collapsed factory, hands raised, focusing a storm of psychic energy that threatened to flatten an entire city block. Thalor knew they could not allow this to continue. He signaled a squad of assault marines, who launched themselves into the air with jump packs, targeting the Weirdboyz with precision. Chainswords met the psychic manifestations, and a violent explosion of energy erupted, throwing debris and Orks alike across the street. The psychic threat was neutralized, but the collateral damage added to the growing chaos and destruction. As the battle wore on, the Orks continued to adapt. Nobz coordinated small squads to flank Marine positions, using debris, fire, and sheer unpredictability to exploit weaknesses in their lines. Mech boys improvised additional weaponry on the fly, welding scrap into flamethrowers, spiked wheels, and artillery that could strike from unexpected angles. Even the Boyz, seemingly mindless, moved with a terrifying efficiency, following the crude guidance of the war boss to strike where the Marines were most vulnerable. Thalor realized that victory would not come through brute force alone. The Orks were too numerous, too adaptive, and too relentless. Instead, he focused on strategic control, holding key intersections and guiding the Orks into traps where concentrated fire could inflict maximum casualties. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate, and every Marine fought with the unyielding discipline that had been drilled into them from the moment they were inducted into the chapter. As dusk approached, the scale of the battle became staggering. Entire city blocks were consumed by fire, the streets littered with the bodies of Orks, civilians, and even a few fallen Marines. Yet the Space Marines held. They had slowed the tide, forced the Orks to expend energy and resources, and protected countless civilians in the process. But the pressure continued to mount. Each wave of Orks seemed larger than the last, each psychic attack more destructive, and each scrap machine more terrifying than anything they had seen before. Captain Thalor stood atop a damaged rooftop, surveying the battlefield. The lines were holding, but just barely. "We cannot falter," he said quietly to himself. "The Orks will come again, and next time they will bring everything." He turned to Sergeant Aurelius. "Prepare the squads, reinforce the choke points, evacuate the civilians to the lower tunnels. Tonight we hold, tomorrow we strike." Aurelius nodded. "Understood, Captain. The Emperor protects." Below, the city groaned under the weight of destruction. Fires burned unchecked, and the cries of both the living and dying filled the night. The Orks, sensing the resistance but never deterred, regrouped in the shadows, preparing for the next wave, their laughter echoing like a prelude to further devastation. The Space Marines, disciplined and unyielding, readied themselves for the battles to come. Valrathon IX teetered on the edge of annihilation, its fate hanging in the balance. And as the sun set over the ruined city, the people who had survived the day understood the grim reality that even the Emperor's angels, powerful and invincible as they seemed, could not stop the wall alone. The Orks would return, stronger, smarter, and more relentless than ever before. The battle was far from over, and the true test of courage, strategy, and survival had only just begun.
The morning sun barely pierced the smoke-choked sky over Valrathon IX, and the city lay in ruins, a shattered mosaic of scorched metal, crumbling buildings, and streets littered with the dead. The Space Marines had fought with relentless discipline, holding key intersections and slowing the tide of the Orks, but the wall was growing stronger by the hour. Reports from scouts and tactical squads indicated that war boss Grimskull the Iron Champa was assembling his full force outside the city, bringing with him waves of Boyz, Nobz, scrapwalkers, and artillery built from scavenged wreckage. The first real stronghold, the bastion that served as the Marines' command and fallback point, stood as the last line of organized defense. Bastion Theta, massive and fortified, had been designed to withstand sieges, but it had never faced anything like the full fury of the Orks. Captain Thalor, standing atop the highest parapet of Bastion Theta, surveyed the streets below. The air vibrated with the distant, rhythmic thud of massive Ork engines and the shrieks of their war cries. Smoke and fire blurred the horizon, masking the sheer numbers of the approaching enemy. Tactical squads and Devastator teams moved into position along the walls, while Terminators secured interior corridors, ready to strike where the Orks broke through. Every Marine understood the stakes. If Bastion Theta fell, the city would be exposed, and the wall could sweep through unopposed, leaving nothing but ash and carnage. "Brothers," Thalor said, his voice booming through the Vox network, "this is our line. Here we hold, or humanity falls. No retreat, no surrender. For the Emperor!" A chorus of voices responded in unison, the sound carrying across the bastion like a thunderclap. The Marines prepared for the inevitable assault, weapons checked, power armor systems running at full capacity, and every squad positioned strategically to maximize both firepower and defensive coverage. From the distance, the Orks emerged in terrifying formations. Grimskull led the charge atop a massive scrap tank constructed from scavenged vehicles and reinforced with jagged metal plating. Nobz and Boyz swarmed around him, their crude weapons glinting in the smoky light. Mech-Boyz rolled forward with new war machines, each bristling with improvised artillery, spiked wheels, flamethrowers, and cannons powered by unstable energy sources. The air itself seemed to quiver as Weirdboyz hovered above, their psychic storms crackling with green lightning, ready to tear through the bastion's defenses. The wall was no longer a chaotic wave. It had become an organized, deadly tide, with every element working together under Grimskull's brutal genius. The first strike came suddenly. Scrapwalkers and Ork mobs surged forward, smashing into the outer perimeter of Bastion Theta. Bolters roared in response, ripping through green flesh and scattering bodies across the ground. Yet for every Ork that fell, two more seemed to take its place. The bastion's walls shook under repeated impacts, reinforced steel groaning and cracking under the relentless assault. Marines fired relentlessly, using every weapon at their disposal to hold the line, but the Orks' sheer numbers and ferocity threatened to overwhelm them. Thalor moved along the battlements, coordinating fire and repositioning squads. He commanded, "Focus on the Mech-Boyz and Scrapwalkers. Take them out before they breach the walls." Devastator teams targeted the war machines, their heavy bolters and missiles tearing into armor, while tactical squads cleared approaching Ork mobs, buying precious seconds for the bastion's defenders. Inside the bastion, Terminators prepared for breaches. The heavy doors and reinforced corridors were the final lines of defense, where even the most powerful Ork machines would be funneled into kill zones. Librarians readied psychic wards, anticipating the attacks of Weirdboyz, and sergeants rallied squads, ensuring that morale remained high despite the overwhelming odds. Yet even as the Marines fought with skill and discipline, the Orks adapted. Mech-Boyz repaired damaged machines mid-battle, welding scrap and reactivating weapons faster than the Marines could destroy them. Nobz climbed over wreckage and scaled walls, forcing Marines into close-quarters combat. Weirdboyz unleashed sudden, unpredictable bursts of psychic energy, collapsing sections of the bastion and throwing defenders off balance. Every tactic the Marines employed was met with a counter. Every defensive measure challenged by the Orks' brutal ingenuity. The pivotal moment came when Grimskull himself led a concentrated assault on the bastion's eastern gate. The scrap tank he rode smashed into the reinforced doors, shaking the entire structure with each impact. Boys poured in behind him, axes raised, teeth bared, and laughter filling the air. Explosions rocked the courtyard as grenades and bolter rounds clashed against crude Ork explosives. Marines fought valiantly, bolters spitting fire, chainswords cleaving through Orks, and power fists smashing opponents with bone-crushing force. But the assault was relentless. The eastern gate finally gave way under the combined weight of the war boss and his Nobz. "Fall back to inner defenses," Thalor shouted, rallying his men. "We hold the heart of the bastion." The remaining Marines retreated to the central command chambers and inner walls, forming a final line of resistance. Here, the Terminators and Sergeant Aurelius's squad took positions, ready to intercept any Ork that breached the outer defenses. Despite their discipline and combat prowess, the bastion was slowly being ground down. Fires consumed the outer courtyards, debris filled every corridor, and the cries of the wounded and dying echoed through the halls. The defenders fought heroically, but the sheer scale of the Ork assault made it clear that the bastion's fall was only a matter of time. Amidst the chaos, a dreadnought, ancient and battle-scarred, emerged from the inner sanctum to reinforce the lines. Its weapons tore into the advancing Orks, creating a path of destruction that slowed Grimskull's assault. The dreadnought crushed Nobz beneath its massive frame, incinerated Boyz with flamers, and fired its assault cannon with devastating precision. For a moment, it seemed as if the tide might be turned. But even the dreadnought could not hold forever. A massive scrapwalker, reinforced with stolen armor and powered by unstable fuel, charged directly at the venerable machine. The collision rocked the bastion, toppling nearby walls and sending debris flying in all directions. Sparks and fire engulfed the dreadnought, and with a final, earth-shaking impact, it fell, immobilized and smoldering. The defenders inside the bastion realized the inevitable. Bastion Theta would fall, and they would have to fight their way out or be destroyed alongside it. Thalor, standing amidst the destruction, assessed the situation with grim determination. He knew that survival depended more than brute strength. He commanded, "Evacuate the wounded, protect the civilians, fall back to the secondary fortifications." The retreat was perilous. Orks surged through breaches, tearing apart corridors and cutting down any Marine who hesitated. Yet the Space Marines executed their withdrawal with precision, forming rearguard actions to cover each other, protecting the retreating civilians, and ensuring that as many defenders as possible reached the inner bastion. By midday, Bastion Theta had been reduced to a smoking ruin. The outer defenses were gone, the courtyard littered with the fallen, and the inner chambers under constant assault. Yet, even in defeat, the Space Marines' resolve remained unbroken. Captain Thalor and his surviving squad prepared to make their final stand within the inner sanctum, determined to buy time for evacuation and regrouping. Grimskull, standing atop the debris of the bastion's shattered gate, roared in triumph. "This bastion is ours! Now the Humies will kneel!" His laughter echoed across the ruined city, a chilling reminder that the war was far from over.
The ruins of Valrathon IX stretched endlessly beneath a sky choked with smoke and ash. Bastion Theta had fallen, reduced to a twisted skeleton of shattered walls and burning debris. The surviving Space Marines had retreated, wounded and exhausted, to a series of hastily fortified positions in the northern sector of the city. Here, amidst the ruins of industrial complexes and collapsed residential blocks, Captain Thalor and his command squad worked tirelessly, assessing the survivors, redistributing ammunition, and planning what would be the last stand for the planet's defenders. The city was no longer a battlefield. It was a crucible. The fires from the previous engagements still burned, creating rivers of molten metal and smoke that twisted and churned over the streets.
Ork mobs patrolled the outskirts, rebuilding their makeshift war machines, tending to the wounded, and laughing with a manic joy that made the air itself seem alive with menace. From the hills beyond the city, the war boss Grimskull Diarn Champa observed his domain, directing waves of Nobz and Boyz, preparing for a renewed assault that would finally crush the remaining resistance. Inside the northern sector, Captain Thalor moved among his squads, speaking with sergeants and tactical leaders. "We cannot hold Bastiu Feta," he said grimly, his voice carrying the weight of command. "But this sector can become our final line. We will make it a fortress, a trap, a gauntlet through which the WAAAGH must pass. Every street, every building, every barricade will work in our favor. We will not merely survive, we will inflict maximum damage, and we will show the Orks that humanity is not so easily broken." Sergeant Aurelius, standing beside him, nodded. "We can fortify the northern industrial zone, concentrate fire in choke points, rig collapsible structures to crush Orks, and create kill zones with flamers and explosives. Civilians can be moved to the underground maintenance tunnels, protected but out of our way." Thalor surveyed the cityscape from the rooftop of a half-collapsed factory. Smoke spiraled from the south, where Bastion Theta had fallen, and green flashes marked the activity of Ork Weirdboyz and Mechboyz. "We have little time," he muttered. "Grimskull is already preparing the next wave. We need to turn this sector into a death trap before he strikes." The Space Marines moved quickly, their discipline turning chaos into strategy. Tactical squads erected barricades from rubble, reinforced weak buildings, and cleared rooftops for sniper positions. Devastator teams set up elevated firing platforms covering streets and intersections that the Orks would be forced to traverse. Assault Marines prepared jump routes, chainswords and power weapons at the ready for sudden counterattacks against mobs attempting to breach the defenses. Every wall, every corridor, and every rooftop was planned to maximize firepower and minimize exposure. Meanwhile, librarians chanted prayers to the Emperor, their psychic wards extending across the sector, ready to counter the unpredictable energy of Weirdboyz. The faint hum of protective wards intertwined with the mechanical sounds of weaponry being loaded and primed, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation. Even in the ruins, the Space Marines moved with a sense of purpose, their presence a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Outside, Grimskull's forces were already mobilizing. Large mobs of Boyz and Nobz streamed toward the northern sector, flanked by Mechboyz piloting heavily modified war machines. Scrapwalkers lumbered across streets, reinforced with scavenged armor and armed with flamethrowers, spiked wheels, and crude artillery. Weirdboyz hovered above the approaching horde, crackling with green psychic energy, ready to hurl devastation upon the defenders. The Orks were organized in a chaotic order, a deadly pattern dictated by instinct and the cunning of their war boss. Grimskull's laughter carried over the battlefield, a sound as terrifying as any weapon, filling the city with the promise of annihilation. Captain Thalor moved to the command center, a reinforced bunker in the heart of the sector. Maps of the city were spread across tables, marked with lines indicating defensive positions, expected Ork movements, and potential kill zones. Communications relays linked squads across the sector, ensuring coordination in the chaos that was about to descend. "We know the enemy's strength, but not their exact approach," he said to his officers. "We must be ready for anything. Our survival depends on discipline, courage, and ruthless efficiency." Aurelius checked the perimeter. "Traps are ready, Captain. Explosives are placed in choke points. Flamers and meltaguns are positioned to maximize effect. Civilians are secured in tunnels beneath the industrial complex. The only unknown is Grimskull himself. He's been patient, gathering his forces. When he strikes, it will be total. We'll need every Marine alive to hold the line. As the day wore on, the northern sector was transformed into a fortress of fire and steel. Streets were rigged with traps, barricades strengthened with debris and metal plates, and sniper positions covered every approach. Devastator squads were stationed to provide overlapping fields of fire, while Terminators patrolled the inner corridors, ready to intercept any Ork that breached the front lines. The Space Marines had turned ruins into an impenetrable maze of death, every movement designed to exploit the Orks' predictable brutality. Civilians huddled in tunnels, listening to the distant rumble of Ork engines and the sporadic crackle of psychic energy. Fear was palpable, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they were protected by the Emperor's angels. Every Marine present knew the stakes. The survival of Valrathon IX, the lives of thousands, and the honor of the Imperium rested on their shoulders. There was no room for error. By nightfall, Grimskull's full force had gathered on the outskirts of the sector. The green tide was immense, stretching across the horizon like a living sea of muscle, metal, and teeth. Scrapwalkers moved in formation, flamethrowers flickering, and the psychic energy of Weirdboyz created a greenish aurora in the night sky. The war boss had chosen his moment. The attack would come with overwhelming force, designed to crush the defenders in one swift, brutal strike. Captain Thalor stood on the rooftop of the command bunker, observing the approaching horde. His armor bore the scars of countless battles, but his posture was unyielding. "This is it," he said quietly. "Tonight we hold the line, or Valrathon IX dies. Brothers, prepare yourselves. The Emperor does not abandon us. Fight with honor, fight with courage, fight until the last breath, for humanity, for the Emperor." Aurelius moved beside him, bolter ready. "They will come," he said, "and we will show them what it means to face the Adeptus Astartes." The Marines checked weapons, adjusted armor, and took up positions. Devastator squads loaded their heavy bolters, tactical squads tightened their formations, assault Marines prepared for rapid deployment, and librarians focused their psychic wards. Every detail had been anticipated, every precaution taken, and yet the tension was palpable. Outside, the green tide waited, biding its time, sensing the defenses, preparing for the final, cataclysmic clash. Valrathon IX's northern sector had become a fortress, a trap, a beacon of resistance amidst a city already half destroyed. The Space Marines were ready, but so too were the Orks. The coming battle would decide the fate of the planet. And in the shadow of the ruined city, amidst smoke, fire, and anticipation, the final confrontation between Captain Thalor and Warboss Grimskull approached. An epic clash of discipline versus chaos, order versus instinct, humanity versus the WAAAGH. The night was still, almost unnaturally so, as both sides braced for the storm. Somewhere in the dark, the first sparks of destruction flickered, heralding the beginning of a battle that would echo across Valrathon IX and beyond. A battle where survival, courage, and the Emperor's will would be tested to the absolute limit.
The northern sector of Valrathon IX erupted into chaos as the WAAAGH surged forward.
Ork mobs spilled into the streets like a living tide, their guttural roars mingling with the screech of scrapwalkers and the crackle of psychic energy from hovering Weirdboyz. Flames licked at the ruins, smoke curling into the dark sky, and the smell of burning metal and flesh hung heavy in the air. Bastion Theta had fallen, but the northern sector was a fortress, a last stand where Space Marines, battered but unbroken, prepared to meet the Orks head-on. Captain Thalor stood atop a reinforced rooftop, power sword in hand, observing the approaching horde. The war boss, Grimskull de Ironchampa, rode a massive scrap tank at the front, his hulking figure adorned with jagged metal, skulls, and the crude symbols of his tribe. Green psychic energy pulsed around Weirdboyz, creating arcs of lightning that illuminated the night. The Orks' momentum was terrifying, their numbers seemingly endless, their rage palpable. "Hold the line!" Thalor roared, his voice carrying across Voxnet. "No step back! For the Emperor!" The Space Marines responded with disciplined fury. Devastator squads unleashed torrents of bolter fire, cutting down waves of Boyz before they could reach the barricades. Tactical squads held choke points, firing, then retreating in perfect rhythm to draw the Orks into kill zones rigged with explosives. Assault Marines launched from rooftops with jump packs, landing amidst Nobz and Boyz, chainswords roaring, tearing through Orks with lethal precision. Every Marine moved as part of a coordinated machine, a deadly counterpoint to the chaotic brutality of the WAAAGH. But Grimskull was relentless. Scrapwalkers crashed into barricades, Nobz tore through reinforced walls, and Weirdboyz unleashed psychic storms that sent debris flying and scorched the defenders. The streets trembled under the weight of the assault, and for a moment it seemed that even the Space Marines might be overwhelmed. Thalor engaged directly with Grimskull, leaping from the rooftop onto the war boss's massive scrap tank. Bolter rounds and crude Ork blades clashed, sparks flying as power sword met crude metal. The war boss swung his axe with terrifying strength, each blow capable of cleaving armor and bone alike. Thalor parried, countered, and struck, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to match Grimskull blow for blow. Around them the battle raged, Space Marines battling Orks in the streets, civilians huddled in tunnels, explosions shaking the crumbling buildings. As the duel continued, Thalor's tactical brilliance and enhanced strength began to turn the tide. He drew Grimskull into a trap, a partially collapsed building rigged with explosives. With a final, decisive strike, he pushed the war boss into the center of the structure. The building exploded, sending debris and green blood flying, but the war boss emerged, wounded and enraged, yet undeterred.
The first light of dawn cast a pale, trembling glow over the shattered city of Valrathon IX. The streets were littered with the remnants of war, burning vehicles, crumbling buildings, and the bodies of Orks and humans alike. The once mighty WAAAGH had been broken, and the green tide that had threatened to engulf the city now lay scattered and defeated, fleeing toward the distant hills. Captain Thalor stood atop the rubble of a half-collapsed factory, surveying the aftermath, his armor scorched and dented, but his posture unyielding. The victory had been hard won, and the cost was written across every ruined block and every fallen comrade. The battle had raged through the night, a chaotic symphony of fire, steel, and psychic energy. Grimskull de Ironchampa, the monstrous war boss who had orchestrated the WAAAGH, had been defeated, struck down in the heart of the northern sector by Thalor's decisive strike. The explosion of a rigged building had finally toppled the war boss's massive scrap tank, and though the creature had fought with unrelenting fury to the last, the strategic brilliance and valor of the Space Marines had prevailed. Around Thalor, surviving Marines moved carefully, securing civilians, extinguishing fires, and neutralizing scattered pockets of Ork resistance. Sergeant Aurelius approached, his face weary but resolute. "The Orks are retreating, Captain. The northern sector is secure, for now. Casualties are heavy, but the civilians have been evacuated. The Emperor has protected them." Thalor nodded, eyes scanning the ruined horizon. "This is only a reprieve," he said quietly. "Grimskull's followers will regroup, and the WAAAGH will rise again. But today, Valrathon IX stands. Today, humanity has prevailed against impossible odds." Civilians emerged cautiously from tunnels and shelters, their faces a mixture of relief and grief. Families embraced among the ruins, their joy tempered by the horror of what they had witnessed. Soldiers helped carry the wounded to temporary field hospitals, while others cleared rubble to create safe paths through the devastated city. The Space Marines moved among them, silent guardians even in victory, their presence a reminder of the Emperor's vigilance. Across the northern sector, burned-out scrapwalkers and destroyed war machines littered the streets. Ork bodies, mangled and lifeless, lay in heaps, testament to the ferocity of the battle. The psychic energy of Weirdboyz had left lasting scars, twisted metal, shattered walls, and lingering arcs of green residue that marked where reality had been torn by chaotic power. Yet despite the devastation, the Space Marines had endured. Discipline, courage, and tactical mastery had allowed them to turn chaos into controlled fury, striking down the overwhelming force with precision and relentless resolve. Thalor lowered his visor, taking a moment to remember the fallen. Brothers in arms, brave defenders, those who had given everything to protect Valrathon IX. Their sacrifice had ensured that the Ork tide was held back, that civilians survived, and that the city would live to see another day. From the outskirts, the sound of distant Ork cries faded, replaced by the hum of recovery and rebuilding. The battle had ended, but the scars of war would remain, a testament to the price of survival. Valrathon IX was battered, scarred, and mourning, yet it had endured. The Emperor had been vigilant, and the courage of his Space Marines had proved that even in the face of overwhelming chaos, humanity could stand unbroken.